Hi, everyone. Welcome back to a podcast to answer your questions on addiction, recovery, and mental health by Wiseman Method Advanced Treatment for Opioid Dependence. I'm Dwight Hurst. As always, I am joined by Claire Wiseman and David Livingston to answer your questions. Today, we're going to be talking about 12-step groups as a support, and particularly, what do we do if that particular resource isn't really doing it for us? So specifically, today's question comes from a listener, from Joe, and he says, 12-step groups don't help me. Is there anything else that I can do to help me maintain sobriety and health? I know we've talked a lot about different approaches and how a one-size-fits-all obviously is not that, and Joe is finding that this is not directly helpful for him to be involved in a 12-step community. What else can he do? It's a good question.
Yeah, you want to start, Claire?
No, you can start.
All right. The first thing I would want to ask him is, it's a hard thing to answer without knowing him better. But ultimately, he's saying that, I can say that sometimes what people need, I think 12 steps can be very supportive. And if people feel isolated in their lives and really feel like they need, a certain type of access to other people and their stories and their interest in sobriety and so forth, it can be very helpful. There are some people that are either uncomfortable with that for a variety of reasons, don't like that process exactly, or maybe they're so busy in their own lives that what they're needing isn't more support per se, as much as what they need is, I would say, a way to get to understand to titrate the tensions and the unmet needs and understand themselves in a way in which they can feel more relaxed, understand and get into specifically the issues that are driving their need to want to cope through a substance, and I think therapy is built for that, depending on the perspective of the therapist you're working with. So there's, I think there's also something called SMART recovery, which I'm not super familiar with. I know some about it. But I think those are the two major avenues, but it really depends on, what the need is, what he's needing specifically that, and I think that has to get assessed.
So kind of, in a way, that's almost like a guidance right there, or a tip is to say, know yourself, maybe know what your own risk factors are. Because if downtime, for example, is a big killer, then you're going to address it differently than if burnout is your killer, in a way, right? If you have to increase your downtime or if you have to increase your structure in your downtime. Kind of
exactly.
knowing where you tend to trip up, maybe.
Right. That you could say that needs drive everything, right? So what, needs drive frustration, they drive, but needs are so varied and they're often not really clear in terms of what they are or their importance, or so when that gets sorted out and that starts to be made clear, you start to have a way forward. So if what you need is, some people sleep horribly. It sounds so basic, but I can't tell you how many people, struggle with sobriety because they're never relaxed because they sleep so badly and they've really never dealt with it. So that's just that's a singular, issue. But if that's never solved, it will leave you more vulnerable, for instance. So you've got to assess what the needs are.
That's a great point, because some of that ties in with just sort of health management. If you are, talking with, your doctor, I guess, and your therapist and things, but also the sleep is something we probably don't think of often enough, as in it's an example of something that you do every day, right? I mean, you sleep every day, hopefully, at least once. And if we think of things in terms of I'm going to a meeting and talking about addiction as a thing that has to do with relapse prevention, but we don't necessarily think of sleep as something that does, and we do it probably more often than we would go to a meeting if we're doing meetings.
Right, and there's no more important regulating function. So imagine if you're going to meetings and you're pushing yourself to get to meetings, and then you haven't had a good night's sleep in weeks or months, or maybe you don't sleep well, and then you've got to assess why, right? Or is there anxiety involved in it? Is it a hereditary issue? There could be other causes of it that have to do with other potential diagnosis. So then you have to assess what's the whole issue around the sleep. So you start to break down what the causes are, and as these things get better, you find that people are less vulnerable. What they need or don't need is getting parsed and sort of figured out, and their lives are getting better, and so something like that.
Then I would go back to the question. 12-step is not working for him. What does it mean, not working? Is he looking at 12-step as a treatment or peer support? And I think that's a very, very big distinguish to make. If you're looking at treatment, it is not treatment. Mm-hmm. And if you expect it to work to treat, chemical imbalance, a depression, or other things that can cause craving, it's not going to work. If you're looking as a place where you have peer support, you can talk to people that have been, in similar conditions than you have, then it's a different story. So I think it's really, really important to distinguish the question here.
It's a really good point. Yeah.
Again, sleep is, as David said, is a major component, but there is another 20 that, I can think of really fast that is also going to make a huge difference. There are people that have severe, chemical imbalances. Mm-hmm. There are people that have severe PTSD. I mean, there are mental health conditions that, if not treated, will lead somebody to crave, self-medication. Mm-hmm. So regardless of how much peer support they have around them. So the question is, what is John expecting to get from the 12-step?
Yeah, it's a great point because, you wouldn't maybe call a plumber and then get upset because he didn't, do your roof correctly. I don't know. Maybe that's a dumb example, but knowing who you're calling and knowing where you're going is important. Like you said, am I going for peer support? Because it's not a therapy. It's not an intervention or a treatment. It's meant to be a support group, a support system. Yeah.
If you want to use the analogy of the plumber, you can call a plumber to fix a plumbing issue, or you can call your neighbors that had plumbing issues and discuss about it. It's not going to fix the plumbing issue, right?
But you did fix my analogy, so that was good.
There you go.
Made it better. Yeah, absolutely. And it's not that I wouldn't talk to my friend about it either, maybe, if it was just something small. So we could, I tend to overextend metaphors, but I like that, knowing what it is. I read a piece of research. This is a while ago, so I don't know if it's true or was true or is true still. Maybe it changed. Anyway, this research has indicated that for many people, having a good social group actually did accomplish some of the same psychological benefits as having a good support group. And this was more, I think this is more oriented around general therapy groups and things, and it may not be true for everyone, but it was very interesting that how powerful a good social group was, to say if they had friends or socialized with friends and family in an effective way, it did a lot of the same things. Maybe I'm causing trouble by saying that, but
no. Listen, it's it's a subject that is very touchy for a lot of people because they base their sobriety on it. And, it's been decades where people hold each other hands in groups,
Yeah.
not to relapse. But again, this NA is based on a book that was written in the late 30s.
Mm-hmm.
We have evolved tremendously, especially, the science of understanding our brains and how the nervous system works and what substance, how can affect us, and so much more.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be very careful if you're using a guide, that was written over 80 years ago.
Yeah.
Use it as support, but not as a guide.
Yeah. I think that a lot of times it won't surprise anybody who's listened to us before that I think we're all probably on the same page that even if you do get something from if you get a lot from a 12-step group, that's great, but you probably shouldn't be limiting yourself to just that either. For most people, it's probably good to also have lots of other balances there of health and management and things like that.
Yeah. And I think you can evolve from that too. You don't need to be there forever.
Mm-hmm.
There's a time in your life that you might need that peer support, and then there's a time in your life we're talking about, a place that you were that was not a good place, not productive, just counterproductive. So, people can and should evolve from the conditions they're suffering from.
We live in a culture in which people get very disconnected, and I think they feel very alone sometimes, and having a place to go where there's people interested in supporting them and helping them and they can get to know can be really useful. And I think that's been a great strength of AA and NA. Sometimes there's also downsides to it and dangers that are inherent within them because, people are also often very vulnerable at meetings like that. And sometimes, can influence each other towards things that aren't healthy. So there's upsides and downsides at times, but that's not always the case. And some people do really benefit from it. But like you're saying, Dwight, a good social group, because you need support. You need, whether from family or your friends or, at times a therapist, or even if it's a good 12-step meeting that you feel supported. If you can find that support, but that's, there's some people with very busy lives and very, have a lot of things going on that really need a different type of help for valid reasons, and or just don't like the process of 12 steps.
And I think one of the main things is that that's okay. A lot of times I think validation is necessary in these situations where you think, well, if it's not working for me, that means I'm not working, or that there's something wrong with me in a way. And I don't really care for that personally. I think being willing and able to talk to people, I think the concern that I see a lot of times people have is everybody knows what a 12-step group is. And it's not uncommon for a spouse or even sometimes a professional in the field to tell someone, I want you to be doing this. I think you should be doing this. And if the person's like, I went and it didn't help, or in some cases even maybe triggered me, I'd like to focus my energies other ways. Sometimes they're confronted with that. Well, you're not taking it seriously then, because I can tell you're not taking it seriously because you're not doing this one thing that I know is a good thing for many people, or people say it's a good thing. And
I agree with you 1,000%.
Yeah.
There's so it's often when I hear, people saying that, especially, parents and loved ones, well, he failed treatment because, he lacked the desire to get well. He did not, did, what was expected of him. Maybe that didn't work for him. I believe everybody wants to be happy. Period. Some people just don't have the tools,
Yeah.
to be happy, or have found the right road to be happy.
And I think it's like so many things where we fear what we think is the majority and it's really the minority. In other words, I think most people who say, "Oh, well, this isn't really working for me." My experience has been that most people who say that about 12 steps or really about anything, most people fall into that category you said, where it's like, "Well, this isn't working for me. I'd like to find something else that is working for me." And I think the minority are probably people that are like, "Nah, it doesn't work because I want to manipulate." Now, maybe I'm being a little optimistic, but I would say one thing that I really do believe is that you can pretty quickly tell the difference. You don't have to say, how can I tell if they're invested? I think you can pretty quickly tell. If someone's saying, I want to focus more on my therapy and I want to focus more on this type of, approach, and they're then not relapsing, they're serious. You can rest assured, just because they're not doing that one thing, if they're not serious about getting healthy, then nothing's going to work for them. They're going to say this isn't right about everything. I don't think it's a marker just because they say it about 12-step groups that they're not going to get better.
But don't you think sometimes they are serious and they wanted bad enough, but fear just overwhelms them? So
I think that's true.
They might be fighting something, based on fear and not based on the will to get well.
And that's absolutely a good point. I think you bring a good point. I didn't mean to cut out people who, like, they mean well and they are serious, but then they still have the bumps in the road or they don't succeed all the time. Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't mean to cut those people out or make it sound like they're not trying. But I think you're absolutely right. It's like trying to ask, why isn't something working? Like you say, instead of saying like, well, it's not working, let's blame somebody.
That's a terrible. Like you're both saying, it's a terrible idea because you immediately put the person into conflict, right, with their own instincts, and then that's probably the worst thing you can do to help somebody. When someone's saying this isn't working for me, first of all you want to understand why, right? Mm-hmm. So because just in articulating the reasons why something isn't working, you will get a sense of who the person is, what they're looking for, and what's not working, and you'll actually get to know them, and you'll also get to know a sense of who they are. So we have this misconception, and it kind of goes to the heart of what I think we're talking about, that we're supposed to be able to choose what's going to work, or choose for other people what's going to work. That's just an absolute fallacy and causes more failures in treatment and help than anything I know. The truth is we discover, right? We discover who people are, and they discover what works for them. You choose it far less. Now, once you've discovered, like, okay, this doesn't work for me, I need to find something more in this area, then yes, you've got to make choices, and you've got to take, responsibility for moving in those directions. But it is far more of a discovery about who we are and what works for us, and the willingness to go through that process than it is being told. And while it's good to keep an open mind so that we can take in new information and go through a discovery process, in the end, it's like I say in all these podcasts, you've got to listen to people because you'll discover who they are. They'll tell you if you're listening, and you'll actually see them sort of unfold in front of you, and they'll be grateful, and they'll be more participatory because they feel like who they are is going to get help. And you have a better treatment.
Absolutely, that's a good point.
Absolutely, but there you go again. If you go back to the question where we started today, is what David is talking is about treatment, individual therapeutical treatment, and what the listener was asking was about a peer support group. So, again, to be heard, to be understood, it's really important, to decipher your needs. And the way you do that is mostly through therapy.
Yeah, and I really like the emphasis on making sure what are you shooting for and what are you trying to get out of something. One of the things that
Right.
occurred to me as you're talking is that there are one thing people might want to try is if the 12-step approach, if that's not really working for them, they may want to give a Google to harm reduction support groups, because harm reduction it's basically just another philosophical orientation that says it basically they err on the side of not telling people how to define their health or sobriety or whatever. But it is a different approach. The other is to say maybe cognitive behavioral addiction support groups. And some of these may be online because they're not necessarily as available. Some of them are run by therapists, and then some are also just support groups. And so there are other kinds of support groups out there. I think is important for people to,
There are,
do a little searching.
and yeah, but again, don't confuse them. They are support groups. So, in the reason I keep going back to this over and over again is because I spend most of my life on the phone with people struggling with addiction or with family members, and most of them have been in so many years, so many treatment centers, different support groups, and they have relapsed over and over again, and they feel lost, they feel hopeless, they feel unheard because they never ever been really treated. And most of these people do have some kind of mental health issue that has not been dealt with, because not because it wasn't obvious, but because there was no professionals diagnosing them. What there was others that have been in the same place they have been or similar places, talking about their own experience.
Right. So these are support groups, and I think you're 100% right. It's rare that people get effective treatment, and as I've said in other of our podcasts, most of the time when I ask people why they're struggling with addiction, they have no idea, even if they've been through all kinds of programs and this and that. They're like, I don't know. It's, or they'll say things like, well, it's a disease. And like I said before, the problem with that is there's no benefit to that thinking in terms of getting better. Right? It'd be like going to the doctor and the doctor saying, well, you've got a disease. There's no usefulness in that type of. So what a doctor does and what anybody does in this field should do is break it down. Well, let's understand. Let's just see what's driving all of this, right? Because, and so as you and you should be able to quickly surmise and help someone see exactly why they're struggling. Now, the why isn't the end of the treatment by a long shot, but it gives you a direction, a real direction. And if you never know exactly why, I mean exactly why, that in a way that feels right to you, like you go, yeah, okay, well, that makes sense. That makes sense. That makes sense. If that isn't happening, you're probably not heading in the right direction. You've got to know why, for starters.
I know people go in sometimes there are certain prescribers, psychiatrists and nurse practitioners I know, who run kind of a little battery of tests. And then, of course, I know psychologists who run a big battery of tests for diagnosis. And yet I know the majority of people I know who actually get treatment or medication, they go in and they might say, you have addiction, and they get, okay, your diagnosis is opioid dependence disorder. Do you ever get depressed? Okay, depression. Yeah, great, let's work on it. And it's like sometimes there's not that time. I say sometimes. I think probably mostly when we go to treatment. Treatment still works a lot of times because a lot of it might be similar, but to really understand ourselves, I am always surprised how infrequently we go and get like testing done to say, take these psychological tests or even get your thyroid checked and different things that can affect your emotions. We just don't do it as often as I think we should.
Absolutely. Yeah. Treat the whole patient.
Yeah.
And again, no one professional can treat the whole patient, but if a professional, can help make a diagnosis and at least, a path of what should be done from here. I think we spoke about this in other episodes before. We all have to continuously work on our health. Our mental health, our physical health is not something that we fix one time and that's it. We don't have to look back. So it could be multifaceted, it could be a chemical imbalance. It could be, again, a lack of sleep because of a hormone imbalance. Could be, an actual cause of trauma. So it could be a million different things. So if one thing didn't work, it doesn't mean you failed. It means you didn't get the right treatment for your health needs. Let's try something else.
Right. And kind of to this end, I was reading something the other day where they were talking about sort of the two main things that people look for in life, which is in order to have a good life, which is, as you said, Claire, to be happy, and then also to have a meaningful life, right? So those are kind of the two things you hear a lot for good reasons. And but then what this person was saying is that there's another. It's actually not necessary to have a meaningful life or even necessarily a happy life to live a good life. And the thing they were also saying is that there are many people who live different types of lives who one of the components that really sort of fortifies them and helps them feel like they're having a good life is their own psychological awareness. So the ability to understand what you're in the midst of creates a whole nother dimension of just feeling like you know how to be with yourself, you know how to be with other people, you can understand it and think about what's happening. And so there's another dimension to it. And I think that as people become more psychologically sort of aware and insightful and have that capacity to kind of have an observing ego of themselves and other people, it's really useful and sort of creates another dimension to having a good life.
And thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. This is going to do it for us today on this question. A lot of complicated things to look at when you're looking for different supports. And above all, we have a recurring message on this show, of course, which is find the treatment that is right for you and find the treatment professionals that are there for you. We're there for you as far as answering questions that you have, and we love to hear them and would love to talk about them on the show. You can get a hold of us by sending an email of your questions or anything else you'd like to share to info@opiates.com. You can also go to our website, opiates.com, or hit us up on Twitter @opiates. Our music is the song Medical by Clean Mind Sound. For David Livingston and Claire Wiseman, I'm Dwight Hurst, and glad to be with you all today. We'll look forward to answering your questions again. Keep asking them, because if you ask questions, you'll find answers. And if you find answers, you can always find hope. Bye-bye for now. Be with you again soon.